There are some people out there that want to be gaming both on a desktop and a laptop. Now, is the Dell G3223D the monitor for you? Well, we're going to find out in this review. Now, first off, in terms of the asking price, it can be found at the time of filming at around £410 in the UK and around $540 in the US. As for its specs, the top line ones that you should know, it's a 31.5-inch IPS panel that runs 1440p at 165Hz, has display HDR 400 and also has AMD FreeSync with also NVIDIA G-Sync compatibility. So to kick off this review, I do want to quickly point out that if you do want to run 165Hz at 1440p, you'll have to be connected over DisplayPort or indeed USB Type-C. This is because the HDMI 2.0 ports are limited in terms of the overall bandwidth, and as a result means you'll be running at 144Hz at 1440p. This is going to be of most importance to laptop gamers, for example those that only have an HDMI output, and as such you'll be limited in terms of the max refresh rate. Nonetheless, I think most people won't be able to tell the difference between 144Hz and 165Hz, but there's a small little disclaimer I wanted to point out at the beginning of the review before getting into the nitty-gritty. Now, with that out of the way, let's get on to its gaming performance. And here, when it comes to my subjective opinion in terms of its input lag, I must say I was left very impressed. Playing games such as CSGO, which is very much intensive in terms of you want a monitor to have a very low input lag, here I had no problems when it came to registering inputs on my mouse. But in terms of the objective data, this was also backed up because I had it tested at 2.7 milliseconds. Just putting into perspective, I recently tested another large-sized 1440p monitor from MSI and it scored 2.5 milliseconds, so it's pretty much in line with some of its competitors. Nonetheless, for a large size monitor, it will certainly suffice. Now, input lag is only one side of the puzzle, so what about when it comes to its response time? Well, here you'll be able to see via the OSRTT tool that I was able to test its response time in the 3 different overdrive modes. First off, in terms of its fast mode presets, I had it tested in terms of its average initial time, which you can see at the bottom left hand side of your screen at 4.16 milliseconds, which is seriously impressive. Now, if we move to its super fast preset, you can see that the time drops down to 3.19 milliseconds, although there's a little bit of extra RGB overshoot. Moving on to extreme, however, you can see that there's a lot more RGB overshoot. This is the red colors towards the middle of your screen, but yet here the average initial time drops down to 3.02 milliseconds. Now, yet again, when it came to my subjective opinion, I found that it was actually playable in terms of its extreme overdrive mode, at least in a game such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive, although in a bit more of a graphically intense game such as Destiny 2, I was siding towards the super fast preset. That said, even in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, when I was going for some op flicks, I did notice a little bit of inverse trailing and therefore meant that it did throw off my experience. And given that the number differences between super fast and extreme is very minimal, and yet super fast incurs very much less inverse ghosting, I actually ended up running this monitor in its super fast preset no matter what game I was playing. And just to re-emphasize the point, here you'll be able to see an image from the UFO Blur Buster test, whereby in the extreme mode preset there's a little bit of inverse ghosting, although it does gradually reduce as you move down the overdrive modes. Now, aside from hardcore competitive gaming, what about when it comes to the other gaming technologies? Well, here the monitor has got AMD FreeSync and also has got the NVIDIA G-Sync compatibility sticker as well. Now, that's not to be confused with a G-Sync module monitor, although they don't pretty much exist at this price point or indeed the sorts of specs that we're talking about, including the competitors. But nonetheless, I thought to point it out because it might be a little bit confusing to some consumers, where this monitor will not have the full VR range of 1 to 165Hz, but rather will run from 48 to 165Hz. Now, I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo without incurring any sort of black screen or flickering issues, and better still, I was able to play Destiny 2 at 1440p at 165Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled and also with HDR, and that was all running on my RTX 3080 when connected over DisplayPort. And so this actually perfectly leads me onto its HDR experience, which is quite frankly poor. This is because the monitor has around 400 nits and therefore gets the display HDR 400 certificate, and when I was playing Destiny 2 I just felt that the overall experience was subdued. Now the problem is further compounded when you look at its competitors, which offer the display HDR 600 certificate. The options from Samsung or MSI get up to 600 nits and thus the HDR 600 certificate, and give you a much better dynamic range, contrast ratio, and of course total peak brightness. Frankly here, if HDR is very much important to you and you're looking for a large size monitor, I would suggest you to look at one of its competitors instead. So moving swiftly on, I'd like to have a quick word for console gamers. And here the monitor should be able to run Full HD at 120Hz, be it if you have a PlayStation or an Xbox. If you do have the latter, however, you'll be able to output 1440p at 120Hz. And the reason Sony does not support it is because they don't produce a 1440p television. Now, thankfully, you can output a 4K signal because the monitor does support it, and as a result, you can have a simulated 4K. And from my own test, I was able to output 4K at 24 Hz. Now the only thing worth considering, however, is that some of its competitors were able to output 4K 60 Hz instead, therefore giving you a much more fluid experience when it comes to gaming. It's worth considering rather than taking my word for it, just because I don't have a console to properly test this monitor, and therefore I can't quite attest to if it can or can't run 4K at 60 Hz. So with the gaming section out of the way, how does the monitor actually look like? Well, it's got a 31.5 inch IPS panel and also has a dedicated sRGB emulation mode that you can select through the OSD. In such mode, I had it tested at 86.2% sRGB gamut coverage and 104.7% gamut volume. You can see below here how it compares to the sRGB standard. As for the actual color accuracy, it sat at 1.33 as an average and a maximum of 4.3, which is a little bit shabby in comparison to some of its competitors. Now the contrast ratio is actually quite poor. I had it tested at 686:1, and with the uniformity compensation, which we'll talk about very shortly, it dropped down to a measly 366:1, which is quite laughable to say the least. Now as for the measured white point in comparison to the target, it was pretty much close at 6040 Kelvin at 100%, and as for the gamma, it sat close to the 2.2 standard. Now if you're not going to be image editing or video grading, you might want to benefit from a wider color gamut monitor, and as a result you might want to go on the standard mode preset. In such mode, you'll be able to see that the sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 gamut all have increased. And indeed here the latter is 91.5 and 104.2% respectively. Underneath you can see how it compares to the DCI-P3 standards. Now as for the color accuracy, here I had it tested in comparison to the sRGB standard, and it's no surprise here that it's dropped to 3.09, whereby higher is worse, and the maximum of 7.72. The contrast ratio hasn't changed, and as for the measured white point, it's 6084 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma curve, I'd like you to actually pay attention to this one over here, because as we're going to be moving on to the next scene, you'll be able to see that it's vastly gone past the 2.2 standard, and that's because the screenshot that you can now see is including with uniformity compensation, which seriously has affected the overall gamma curve. Now it is worth considering here that the gamut volume and gamut coverage hasn't really changed all that much, and as for the overall color accuracy, it has dropped to an average of 5 and a maximum of 10.69. Ultimately here the uniformity compensation does have a negative knock-on effect, and is something that you should consider if you're going to be using it. Now it is worth considering that in terms of its uniformity compensation mode, the maximum brightness sits at 228 nits. Indeed it is capped, whereby in maximum SDR or in HDR you can get up to 412 nits, as I did allude to before. As for minimum brightness, it is pretty impressive at 37 nits. So you might be wondering, what on earth is this uniformity compensation he keeps banging on about? Well, as you'll be able to see on your screen right now, on the left and right hand sides, there's quite a lot of orange boxes, and of course there's somewhat panel lottery, but nonetheless when you enable uniformity compensation there's a lot more green boxes, and that's because the image is a lot more uniform. Now why on earth should you consider this or care about it? Well, uniformity compensation will be of use for those people who are going to be doing any sort of image editing or video grading. The problem, however, is that it's limited to the standard mode preset only, and as a result, if you're on the sRGB mode preset, which is the mode that's photo editors or video editors will probably be using, because that's the web format that is used across the world, then here you won't be able to actually use the uniformity compensation altogether. So therefore it's kind of defying logic. It's limiting the brightness and contrast ratio for gamers or those people editing in potentially Adobe RGB or DCI-P3 modes, potentially. I'm not really sure. Ultimately, it doesn't really make too much sense to me, and I think Dell should potentially address this on a future firmware update, although I would have very little hopes of that actually happening, given that this has been the case for many years across other Dell monitors. Now elsewhere, a quick word on backlight bleed, which I again appreciate is somewhat panel lottery and will depend in terms of every panel, but nonetheless on my tested model it was a little bit noticeable on the top right hand corners. It's not too much of a problem when it comes to gaming, but if I was in a pitch black room on a pitch black image, then it's something that I would want to consider potentially looking at a VA panel altogether, especially given that the better contrast ratio that I could attain on a VA panel in comparison to an IPS panel. Now moving on to the monitor's OSD, can be accessed through a physical joystick button found behind the monitor. Now through it you'll find a plethora of different options, such as the preset modes, which I've covered already, such as the standard and or the sRGB modes. It is worth considering that if you're outside of any other mode than standard, you will not have access to the uniformity compensation, which you can find on the display section. Equally, if you were to enable the Vision engine, this will also disable that option. Now as for game enhanced mode, I'd leave that disabled. AMD FreeSync, it's completely up to you in terms of the games that you're playing, and for response time, as I did mention before, I'd very much urge you to run the super fast mode. Console mode gives you extra options such as color and gamma, but this is very much to do with if you are running a console such as a certain game, it might be quite handy. The Vision engine I'm not going to enable in this demonstration because it will black out the screen, but it effectively gives you extra options such as crosshair placement. Now as for brightness and contrast, you can adjust it through this tab. Input source is pretty self-explanatory, and as for display, other than the uniformity compensation, it is worth considering that the USB-C prioritization, high resolution or high data speed might be of importance to you, and equally as for the smart HDR, if you were to disable it altogether, it means HDR cannot be triggered on, so it permanently disables HDR via the monitor, which is quite unique. Here I would very much suggest you to run the display HDR 400 mode rather than the emulation desktop movie or game HDR, and therefore means that if you do have an HDR signal, the monitor will recognize it and then switch to an HDR image. As I did mention before, HDR isn't exactly that impressive. Now PIP and PBB mode can be enabled via this tab, and as for audio, this is only for you to output it via a 3.5mm headphone jack because the monitor does not have any built-in speakers. As for the menu, it's pretty self-explanatory, and as for the personalization, you can disable the power button LED, can be found underneath the monitor, although we'll touch upon the LED lights found behind the monitor very shortly. And then you've got the USB charging, which you can enable or disable, be it in on or off state of the monitor. And then you've also got a little display information where it gives you an indication of the resolution and refresh rate that the monitor is running on, a firmware, and also some self-diagnostics, which can be quite handy. So moving on from the monitor's OSD, it is worth considering the overall aesthetics, and here it's got a three-side borderless design and a relatively thin bezel at the bottom. Better still, the stand doesn't have a garish look to it, nor does it have something that's quite inconvenient, in other words like a triangular look. Instead, it's quite flat and therefore should fit on most desktop setups. Better still, the stand also provides height, tilt, and also swivel adjustments, although it's worth considering here it can't be pivoted, in other words being used on a vertical format. Now it is worth considering that at the rear of the monitor there is a blue LED light, and here you might think, oh well, I can quickly disable it, but you might have noticed over here that there is actually no means of disabling via the OSD, at least not at the time of filming and on the firmware that I was running. Potentially Dell might be able to address this, and is apparently something that they're looking to. At least when I looked on the Dell forums, I saw one person complaining about it and talking to Dell support about it. Here I don't quite understand why Dell have not included the option to fully disable these blue LED lights, because a lot of people, including myself, will not want to use it and or will want to reduce their energy consumption. Now another thing that might be quite odd is the fact that Dell have only included 15 watts of power delivery via its USB Type-C port, and therefore makes it redundant for those people looking to use this monitor with a laptop and simultaneously charge their laptop without having to plug it into an external power supply. Now, the only logic that I can think of here is that this monitor is aimed at the gaming crowd. And as a result, if you have a beefy gaming laptop, you're going to have a GPU that's going to draw a lot more power than 15 watts, or indeed up to, let's say, 65 watts from what I've seen on other productivity USB Type-C monitors. So the 15 watts of power delivery doesn't actually make any sense anyway, because you're going to need more power. But nonetheless, it still would have been great to see Dell include up to, let's say, 65 watts of power delivery for those people who, let's say, are using the monitor for USB Type-C for work purposes and therefore for their work laptops, and then using it for gaming purposes when they're at their desk and when connected up to a desktop computer and running it over DisplayPort or indeed over HDMI. Another thing worth considering in comparison to some of its competitors, it does not have a KVM switch built in, and therefore means that you can't easily switch between two different sources. In other words, let's say a laptop and a computer, while using your peripherals directly plugged into the monitor rather than having to plug them in and out of different sources. So something else worth considering. So with all of that, you can potentially gauge where I'm going with my verdict. I cannot see myself recommending this Dell monitor given what else you can find out there in the market. At least at the time of filming, there are better alternatives that come in at pretty much the same price, from the likes of Gigabyte, Samsung, MSI or AOC, among many others. All my recommendations will be down in the description below for your own consideration. The only real thing going for this Dell monitor is the fact that its response time and its input lag are impressive, and there's no doubt about it that in terms of the pure gaming side of it, it does a good job. I just think that Dell could have done a little bit better elsewhere. Now, I'd be intrigued to hear your thoughts of the monitor down in the comment section below, and if you've liked this detailed independent review, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which are greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.